Hi, I'm Zephyr Matheny, and I wrote The Adventure of It All, which I'm reading chapter by chapter. This is part 1, chapter 2, Death. I was 30 years old, and for once my mother was living with me, not the other way around. I had finally moved out, but my mom's declining health and low finances made getting by on her own nearly impossible. I was planning on moving into a better apartment after getting approved for a Section 8 voucher, so I let my mom move in with me. It was wonderful having her there, but it wasn't perfect. I think my mom and I were too similar in many ways. We could fight and fight and fight, but we loved each other deeply. We understood each other in ways that nobody else did. When I woke up on Halloween morning, 2.5 months after we moved in together, I could hear my mom's voice. She was talking on the phone, and her voice sounded bright and cheery. She must have been talking to the receptionist at her doctor's office, because her voice had that forced professionalism in it, but it sounded healthier than it had in a long time. I listened to her for a while, until she left to go smoke outside. I didn't have any plans until the afternoon, so I went back to sleep. I woke up when my mom called out to me for help. "My blood sugar is dropping," my mom called out to me. I jumped out of the bed because I knew the drill. My mom had type 2 diabetes, and even though her blood sugar ran high most of the time, her insulin sometimes made it drop too low, and when it did that, it happened without much warning. I went out to the living room and sat on the couch next to my mom. She had gotten a bowl of instant oatmeal and was eating it. I got the machine to test her blood sugar out of her purse and poked her finger. Her blood sugar was supposed to be at least 80. It was 50. If my mom's blood sugar had been much lower, she would have been unconscious. It was the end of the month, and we didn't have much food in the house, let alone anything with significant amounts of sugar. My mom told me that she had some small cans of prune juice in the fridge, and I grabbed them and I brought them back to the couch. My mom also pulled a box of emergency hard candies out of her purse. I opened a can of prune juice and handed it to her. She had finished the oatmeal, but was starting to shake. I checked her blood sugar again, 70-something. This was good. It was going up, and pretty fast, too. In the middle of trying to raise her blood sugar, my mom then mentioned something about her part of her face going numb. I figured it was just a low blood sugar, so I didn't pay much attention to it. And then my mom, who had been sitting up, laid back against the back of the couch. It was like watching an exhausted person take a break from fighting a battle. I checked her blood sugar again. 80. "Mom!" She mumbled something about the Arctic, but that's the only word I could catch. "Mom, say something!" She mumbled something else, but I couldn't understand it. "Mom, if you don't answer me, I'm going to call 911. "No." And more mumbling, but less of it. This went on a few more times until I got no response from her at all. I called 911 and told them that my mom was unresponsive after a low blood sugar episode, but that her blood sugar had gone up to 80. When the paramedics came a few minutes later, my mom was sitting back, she was still sitting back unresponsive. They asked me some questions and tried to get her to respond. It was a blur of paramedics, stuff being moved around, and questions that I didn't know all of the answers to. The one thing that I remember clearly was that one of the paramedics picked up a prescription bottle off of an end table next to my mom. It was a bottle of Percocet, prescribed by my mom's doctor. It was something that she took for her diabetic neuropathy, which caused her severe pain. My mom took the Percocet responsibly and was closely monitored by her doctor. My mom had been taking it for at least a few years with no issues. That bottle said one thing to the paramedics: overdose. They paid no attention to me telling them about her blood sugar. They told me that it was either an overdose or that she was faking it and had something mentally wrong with her. I was confused for 2 reasons. First, my mother never took more than what was prescribed because she knew that if she did, she would have to suffer later in the month when she ran out. Second, my mom had anxiety around people, particularly people she didn't know, and especially in her home. Several men that she didn't know in her home, she would have been conscious and horrified at that situation. The paramedics wouldn't listen to me, though. The only tests they did were to check her blood sugar, which was still normal, and to do a quick stroke test, which the paramedic decided that she had passed. They labeled her a drug addict or mentally ill, and they begrudgingly took her to the hospital, which was a few blocks away. I stayed home but called my grandparents to let them know what had happened. They brushed it off understandably, because this wasn't my mom's first trip to the ER. My mom had been hospitalized quite a few times, especially in the last several years. But this was different. I called the hospital later in the morning and talked to a nurse. The paramedics had given my mom Narcan to counteract the Percocet. The nurse told me that the hospital had given her another dose. I was told that she had had a CT scan that had come back normal. I took a very long nap, worn out from the events of the morning that lasted most of the day. I woke up to someone banging on my back door. I ran to see who would do that, but it was my 78-year-old grandfather. The hospital had released my mom with a questionable diagnosis of seizure. She was sitting on the chair on our back porch. She looked completely out of it and was wearing blue paper pants that didn't fit. They weren't big enough, so half of her butt was hanging out. My grandpa had my mom's skirt in a bag, and I was confused as to why she wasn't wearing it, since it didn't smell like urine. There was a man I didn't know with him. My grandpa said that the man was a neighbor of mine and my mom's, who came to the rescue when my mom fell on my grandpa when he tried to get her out of the car. I was furious. My mom was in absolutely no condition to be sent home from the ER. I told my grandpa this, and he agreed. We got my mom into the apartment and onto the couch. The hospital said that she just needs to sleep, so just let her rest for a while. Okay. My grandpa sat next to my mom on the couch, and she picked up the box of emergency hard candy from earlier. She looked like she was trying to say something about it, maybe something funny, but all she could manage was some slurs and a half smile. My grandpa watched her do this, and he hugged her and cried. My grandpa was a fireman in the Navy. He doesn't cry. Seeing my grandpa cry triggered something in me, and for the first time all day, I realized that something was really not right, and I cried too. My mom got out the word "Dad" and frowned. When my grandpa left, my mom fell asleep on the couch. I went to my room determined to let my mom just rest for a while. A few hours later, I was talking to one of my best friends, Star, on the phone. I told her that the hospital had given my mom 2 Narcan shots to counteract the Percocet overdose that the paramedics insisted my mom was suffering from, but that my mom had come home in just as bad of a condition. Star told me to go check my mom's blood sugar immediately, because Narcan can make a person's blood sugar skyrocket suddenly. I told her that I was planning on calling 911 in the morning if my mom wasn't any better, but Star insisted that I check on my mom right then. My mom's blood sugar was over 300. It shouldn't have been over 150, and she was completely unresponsive, and her lips had a gray tint. I called 911 immediately, and the operator wanted me to do CPR on my mom, but I knew I wouldn't be able to lift my mom off the couch and get her on the floor without hurting her. When the paramedics came, at least 2 of them were ones that had come that morning. They treated my mom even worse this time, yelling at her and acting like she needed to just get up and cooperate. My mom was trying to cough, but it came out a sort of a gag, like she was choking. I insisted that they take her to a different hospital, the bigger hospital across town, but they tried to convince me that it would be better to take her to the first one. I stood my ground, and they finally agreed to take her to the bigger hospital. I called my grandpa because I wanted my mom to have someone to advocate for her, but I don't drive. My grandpa rushed to the hospital to meet my mom. I don't know how long it took for the second hospital to admit her, but they finally did. They weren't sure what was going on with her. First, they thought it was a heart attack. Some enzymes were elevated in her blood. And then they thought that a recent minor weight loss had released Percocet that had been stored in my mom's fat cells, which would have caused an overdose. Eventually, they discovered that it was a stroke, albeit a strange one. From what I understand, my mom's sudden drop in her blood sugar triggered a massive stroke that affected a large part of her brain. It didn't appear as a typical stroke, hence why the paramedics that came the first time said that she had passed the stroke test. The kind of stroke my mom had caused her to just fall asleep. I was told that by the time my grandpa left after bringing my mom home on Halloween, my mom had already slipped into a coma. It's possible that my mom was in a coma from the moment she closed her eyes that morning. I've had my share of tragedies in my life, but I'd never had someone close to me die. My mom and I'd had brief discussions about not letting her be a vegetable and to cremate her after she dies, but I never thought that I would actually need to make the decision to pull the plug. I always assumed that my mom would die, and someone else, like a doctor or a police officer, would tell me about it after the fact. My family came together close to the end of my mom's life. All of us in my grandparents' living room for the very first time, except for my mom. We had to figure things out together, but ultimately it was on my shoulders because I'm her only child, her next of kin. Even my grandparents who created her had no official say according to the hospital. I knew that my mom would want to be let go, and I had been as ready as I could be, but since I found out what was wrong, I knew there was no hope that my mom wasn't going to get any better. I had to hold back, though, to let my family go through the process of letting go. Eventually, most of us ended up in a tiny conference room with a doctor. He was very nice and very patient with us. He explained why my mom basically had no hope, but that we could choose to keep her alive, and that she would be in excruciating pain until her body eventually gave up, however many years down the road. Even though my voice is the one that the hospital required, I wasn't alone when I said no. I wasn't alone when I shook my head and said that I didn't want her to suffer and that she had requested to be let go in this type of situation. That was on Sunday, November 6th, 2016. I said my goodbyes to her that evening and told my family that I couldn't handle going back. I didn't want to see my mother suffer anymore, and I couldn't handle seeing her die. The doctor had explained to my family and me would remove life support. First, they would give my mom morphine that evening. The next day, they would start to turn the oxygen down slowly until finally it was off. Then they would remove the tubes. They would continue with the morphine to keep my mom comfortable until she passed. On the morning of November 9th, I woke up and the first thing I did was check the news online to see who won the election. After expecting Hillary Clinton to win, I was shocked and devastated. A few minutes later, I received a call from my grandma saying that my mom had passed away the night before. My aunt and uncle were with her when she passed, and my grandparents had arrived around the time of her death. My mom had been an organ donor, and even though she was diabetic and had a large number of health issues, and even though she was extremely nearsighted and had the beginnings of cataracts, she was able to donate her eyes to 2 people. I cried a few times right after my mom's death, but I was mostly numb. I struggled to sleep, to eat, to really feel anything at all. There was no funeral because we couldn't afford it, and I didn't know who to invite. My mom didn't have a lot of friends, and in the last several years of her life, she had been in and out of the hospital so much and had had so many health issues that it was all she could handle to just focus on being in as little pain as possible. Stay tuned for Part 1, Chapter 3, Plans.